Welcome to this webinar. This is Lenny Farlee, and I'm an extension forester with Purdue University's Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. And in this webinar, we're going to talk about tree silvics and succession, which is a biological basis for forest management. And so this is going to be covering some of the basic biology and ecology of forest trees and how that impacts how we plan and apply management in forest environments for different outcomes. And so some definitions. What is silvics? A variety of ways we could define this. One way is the characteristics of tree species that define their life history, growth, response to the environment, and ecology. And also we can think about how they impact and respond to other elements of the forest. And then also the interaction of tree genetics and the environment. And this applies to individual species, but also groupings of species altogether. And then what is succession? And so ecological succession is a series of progressive changes in the species that make up a community over time. And so these communities are dynamic, and we see changes based on the changing environments, in some respects created by those species themselves. And there's two main types of ecological succession. There's primary succession, which begins with bare rock. And so this might be an avalanche area, a lava flow, or any other number of places where we really don't even have a soil medium yet. And so it progresses through the formation of soil and then the successive development and replacement of ecological communities through time. What's more common here in Indiana and around the central hardwood region of the United States is secondary succession. And this takes place in areas where a pre-existing community has been disrupted, destroyed, or removed, perhaps due to events like forest fires, logging, or natural calamities. And we have a redevelopment of communities successively on that land. And this, in fact, is one of the things that initiated some of our secondary succession here in Indiana and the Midwest, and that was farming and then abandonment of unsustainable farmland. So this picture is from southern Indiana. It's a farmer trying to make a go of it on these steep hillsides. You can still see some of the stumps from the trees that were cleared off this area. And many of those farms were not successful due to excessive erosion and loss of productivity, and ultimately the inability to sustainably produce a crop and make a living on these farms. And many of these areas now have reverted to forest naturally or have been planted back to forest trees. And then finally, what is silviculture? And silviculture is the theory and practice of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, health, and quality of forest stands to achieve objectives of management. And so we're looking at both the biology of the forest, but also what we hope to accomplish in that forest. More simply, we could say the growing and cultivation of trees. And it really comes down to applying an understanding of silvics and succession to achieve management objectives. And there are a variety of things that figure into silvics, as we've mentioned. So here's just a few, but there are others certainly. So the native range and climate tolerances of individual species, the site and soil tolerances of those species, how much shade they will tolerate in different sections of their lifespan. So some trees have different shade tolerances as seedlings as compared to middle-aged or older trees. The relative growth rates of those trees, moisture availability and timing on the sites and what those trees require, the impact of air movement and humidity on the health of trees, and this may relate to disease susceptibility in some cases. Animals and other pathologies, and so what impact does browsing or other animal use of these trees have? And then what pathologies are they susceptible to in terms of diseases, insects, or other organisms that may attack these trees in different locations? And then, of course, disturbances. And disturbances have a big impact on the successional process in terms of what they do to forest stands and the individual trees in them and how they respond. And there are a variety of different pathways for succession in forests. And so early on in secondary succession, we may have an invasion of some of these sites that have been disturbed and or cleared of vegetation by what we call pioneers. And so these are species that are able to travel either through wind, water, or wildlife. and quickly occupy sites. And so some good examples are sumacs, often spread by birds, black cherry, once again, spread by birds, sycamore, spread by the wind with that light fluffy seed, sassafras, also bird spread, black walnut, rodents moving those seed. And obviously they're not going to move as far, but if there are walnuts in the vicinity, it's a pretty good pioneer species, can grow quite aggressively on good sites with those large seed. And then tulip tree also wind spread and very responsive to full sunlight. Some other trees are able to become successful on sites based on their ability to tolerate extreme environmental conditions are very difficult to grow on sites. And so one group that we'll list here first is very capable of growing on incredibly dry, drouthy, or shallow soils. And this includes species like blackjack oak, Virginia pine, and chestnut oak. Similarly, we have some species that are very tolerant of high water tables or even standing water in some cases. And so some of those species are things like swamp white oak, black ash, and bald cypress. And so they have a successional advantage on these sites because they're tolerant of these very difficult conditions where other species are not. We've also got light tolerance. And so intermediate light or disturbance cycles, we're thinking about species that are tolerant of some shade, but not a lot. And so forests that have kind of broken canopies, very little understory, this is oftentimes related to disturbance like fire. And so things like white oak, scarlet oak, shagbark hickory, white ash, and pignut hickory do well in these environments. On the other hand, we have species that are very tolerant of shade, deep, heavy covers of forest overstory that are relatively undisturbed and solid, casting a lot of shade on the forest floor. Species that are tolerant of that and can regenerate in those situations include things like sugar maple, American beech, American basswood, ironwood, and American hornbeam. And so these different strategies, if we can say it like that, for these trees allow them to dominate sites over time because they can tolerate the conditions that are there. If those conditions aren't in place, they may be at a disadvantage, and we find other tree species doing better. And so this is a very simplified view of kind of the progression of succession in the absence of an additional disturbance. And so we may have primary succession happening on exposed rocks, area where no soil exists, and it may be invaded by things like lichens that actually are producing some organic matter, gradually developing a soil medium that things like mosses or small annual plants might be able to invade. And that's the progression. Once we get enough soil substrate available, though, we may see a variety of other species trying to invade. And as those species become longer lived, larger root systems, and able to grow taller, they gradually get an advantage over some of the early invaders. And so they can reach for the sun, dominate those sites with their canopies, and start excluding other species. However, if they can't regenerate their own progeny in shade, they have to wait for a disturbance to be able to reemerge and maintain themselves on sites. And so we have this progression to young forest trees, things like tulip tree, wind blown and fast growing, but they cannot regenerate in their own shade. And so they would be dependent on some future disturbance to regenerate on that site. Now, if there's a fire or a windstorm that blows down some of the trees, and we have kind of an open, broken canopy, not much of an understory with a fire maybe running through, things like oak and hickory get an advantage because they're very tolerant of those conditions, can resprout after fires, do well in medium light conditions, can tolerate droughts, and so they'll survive in situations that might kill tulip tree. It's just too dry for them to grow. But in the absence of those disturbances and the forest canopy starts to thicken, what we find is those trees that will tolerate a lot more shade and can regenerate their seedlings in that shade become dominant and form what we call a climax community. And that community can regenerate itself over time in the absence of disturbances. And so the typical climax community in many of our sites here in Indiana and the Midwest is the maple and beech forest. But like I said, if we get a big disturbance, that sets succession back and allows some of these other species to come back into the areas. We can also look at it in terms of the dynamics of trees based on how long they live. and how tolerant they are of a variety of conditions. And so this is the development of a forest stand from bare soil conditions over a period of 250 years. And what we see is some of the early pioneers, things like sweet gum and tulip tree, take off very rapidly. Now, sweet gum does not live as long as tulip tree, so we see a pretty rapid drop of the importance of sweet gum over time. However, tulip tree has a very long life and actually get to be a very large tree. And so it accumulates a lot of biomass in these areas and is actually a dominant tree for centuries in many cases. But as we said, in the absence of disturbance and additional sunlight, it's not going to be regenerating itself. We see some other species with a little more shade tolerance, like red maple, starting to come into the stand. And then in about 50 years, we see an invasion of white oaks and hickories. And that might be related to some sort of disturbance, maybe a drought that thinned out the canopy, killed some of the overstory trees, maybe fire that allowed some of those seedlings to get established. And the oaks are also quite long lived. So once they get established, they can also maintain themselves on those sites pretty well. Beech, very shade tolerant, and so it gradually develops also and gains biomass in that stand and can maintain itself over time because it can regenerate trees in the shade. Very similar with dogwood as well. So very interesting dynamics based on the different characteristics or silvics of the trees in this stand. So how do we use these characteristics like silvics and succession as principles to manage forests? And so understanding the life cycle of these trees and recognizing their position in those successional pathways helps direct our decision making in terms of management practices that'll favor the establishment of those species we want to grow. And so shade tolerance is one of the things that we look at that helps us select appropriate management practices to favor certain trees or plant communities. And so if we have species that do best in open conditions, we need to essentially create the disturbances that create those open conditions that allow those species to regenerate. If we're looking at species that have medium shade tolerance and really depend on some level of mild disturbance, well, we've got to introduce those elements to forest stands. And so it might be things like prescribed fire, understory thinning, and with some canopy thinning to favor the regeneration of things like oak and hickory. If we're looking at favoring the shade tolerant species, we're oftentimes thinking about minimizing how much disturbance we do because those species will have the advantage in that situation with their ability to regenerate in full shade. And so here's a rating of a variety of species shade tolerance. And I should mention a caveat here. Shade tolerance does vary in trees based on the age. Some tree species have pretty good shade tolerance early on as seedlings and then gradually lose some of that tolerance and need more full sunlight to develop. But this is a general good guide for medium to older trees. So very tolerant of shade. Some of our most familiar ones in our understory and actually becoming more dominant in Indiana forests because we don't have as much disturbance as we historically had. Sugar maple, beech, hop hornbeam, flowering dogwood, not native to Indiana, but American holly and balsam fir, and also scattered native populations of eastern hemlock, all very tolerant of shade and able to regenerate in heavy shade. A little less tolerant, but still able to establish in forest understories includes red maple, silver maple, box elder, basswoods, persimmon, buckeye, northern white cedar, white spruce, black spruce, red spruce. The spruce is not native to Indiana, but native to the Midwest. And so these are all fairly tolerant of a significant amount of shade, not quite as tolerant as the previous group, but still able to regenerate in understories. Now we start getting to the intermediate shade tolerance group where there's usually a need for some level of disturbance, either canopy and understory thinning through fire or a variety of other means, perhaps human intervention with thinning. So eastern white pine, bald cypress, white oak, red oak, black oak, American elm, hackberry, white ash, magnolias, yellow birch, and American chestnut. Intolerant. These species need access to a fair amount of full sunlight through at least part of the day to do well. And some of them need quite a bit of sunlight exposure to actually continue to survive and also maintain a growth rate that would be competitive with surrounding trees. And so here we've got species like black walnut and butternut, some of the hickories, tulip tree, black gum and sweet gum, sassafras, American sycamore, black cherry, Kentucky coffee tree, eastern red cedar, red pine, and Virginia pine. And I would say I do see young hickory saplings and seedlings in the forest understory, but oftentimes to make good development, they do need additional sunlight to do well. Also true with some of the ash in many cases. And then species that are really completely intolerant of shade and really need full open conditions to do well and regenerate are tamarack, also called Eastern American larch, willows, aspens, cottonwood, black locust, jack pine, and Osage orange. And so recognizing the various shade tolerances help us think about what management practices are going to favor the regeneration of each of these species. And we do have fire adapted species. And so we've talked about that intermediate shade tolerant group where understory fires, surface fires essentially that are killing smaller diameter trees and shrubs may favor the development of these species, particularly if they are able to sprout from root systems and or have thick bark and can resist fire. And so some of these fire adaptation or tolerance characteristics of species include that thick bark to resist fire. And species like oaks and hickories develop that with age, black walnut as well, in fact. A compartmentalization of injury and decay. And so things like white oak and black walnut actually can resist decay pretty well because they can compartmentalize that damage and don't naturally rot out very easily. So even if they do get damaged by a fire or other disturbance, oftentimes they can maintain themselves in stands. The ability to resprout after a top killing fire from the root system. And so that's a great advantage if you're occasionally hit by surface fires that will kill the tops. And then some species have seeds that are released from cones by heat or are favored in their germination by fires preparing those soils and sites for the dropping of seeds and their growth. And so that's also an adaptation to occasional fire in stands. And so that's something we can think about in terms of applying prescribed fire to favor these species in the landscapes they're in. And oaks are really kind of the poster child for that fire adaptation here in Indiana. Larger specimens typically have good thick bark that resists fire damage. The white oak group has good decay resistance. And then, in fact, the seedlings and saplings can oftentimes reproduce by sprouting from root systems if they're top killed. The other thing we've got to think about is the frequency and intensity of fire and what kind of impact it has. And so pretty commonly, fires were human set, both before European settlers and afterwards. Native American peoples were using fire as a land management tool for thousands of years here, and actually were burning fairly frequently based on what we can determine from historical records and evidence in the forests. And so the fire intensity would have been low to medium in many cases. And this would consume understory litter, things like leaves and small twigs. If the conditions were dry enough, we would actually get larger logs and hollow trees burning in many cases. And this oftentimes would have high enough intensity to top kill smaller trees and shrubs. And so if we have these occasional lower intensity fires, we get somewhat of an open understory like we see in this picture to the left. And this is actually a stand that has been had prescribed fire applied to it to produce this open understory condition. If we have more intense and more frequent fires, we can actually get what we call a savanna. And so this is where we have prairie plants dominating in the understory, but scattered large trees. And so these are many scattered large white and bur oak with good thick bark, so they're resistant to fire, but there's a lot of grasses and forbs in the understory. And so when fire catches here, it burns pretty intensely and can kill a lot of smaller materials. And also, if fire frequency is pretty high, it will have a tendency to keep woody regeneration at bay. And so this is a higher intensity and more frequent fire history that maintains this habitat type. And then if we've got really high fire frequency and intensity, we typically will get prairie development. And so woody vegetation just isn't really get an opportunity to establish itself because of fire frequency. It's always top killed back. And so the forbs and grasses that are adapted to this prairie fire environment are the ones that dominate on these sites. Now, if we take that fire disturbance out, we'll start to see woody species encroachment and a change of this type of habitat to the next stage, which will be dominated by woody vegetation if we don't have the disturbance of fire. So thinking about those characteristics, let's take a look and think about what kind of silvicultural approaches we could use for shade intolerant species to favor them on the landscape. And so we know they need significant exposure to sunlight to regenerate and grow well. And so one of the things we're looking at are openings. And so on the right is an opening that was actually I created on my property through a timber harvest. And this had provided an opportunity for things like tulip tree and black walnut to reproduce in that opening. And so I provided areas of anywhere from a half acre to an acre. We had surrounding black walnut and tulip trees there that are providing seed. And so once we essentially turned the lights on with that harvest, removing the overstory, that regeneration happened naturally. And it's progressing really rapidly. Those things grow really quickly once it's got access to the sunlight and all of the soil resources there without competition from the large trees. Now, one of the issues we run into in some places is some of the species that we might desire may be really picked on by white-tailed deer. And so on the left-hand side, we've got a planting done by a landowner in a forest opening. And to control the species composition and also to protect them, he has planted seedlings of oak and walnut and then put up an electrified deer exclusion fence. And so this is an electrified band that is also baited either with peanut butter or odor discs that will attract deer. The deer will get a little jolt on their nose or tongue, and it forms somewhat of a psychological invisible barrier that helps keep the deer out of that area, giving those seedlings an opportunity to grow. But once again, those wouldn't be doing that if we did not have those open conditions where we've cleared out the competing vegetation and allowed full sunlight conditions to be in place. And we can do this with larger scale cuttings like clear cuts. And so the cuts on my property were what we call small group openings, less than a couple of acres in size. We can go to larger scale and create larger openings like this 5-acre clear cut on a property in Monroe County, regenerating really aggressively to a wide variety of species with all of that open area, seed sources on site and coming in from the edges, and then some of the sprouts from the cut stems. These areas regenerate very quickly, oftentimes have a wide diversity of plants, and provide really important wildlife habitat as well. It's actually pretty rare on our landscape now. Young forests are one of the rarest forest age types in Indiana. So these are actually very positive practices for a wide variety of reasons. And the good news is that if we create these systems, we get fast growth. And so this is a clear-cut area on a state forest 15 years after the clear cut. And it's regenerated very aggressively. And you can see now it's a young forest. So it's transitioned from relatively open canopy to a lower in stature than mature forest, but still a closed canopy forest that's developing rapidly and changing quickly. And we've got all those interesting species dynamics going on based on growth rate and competition and tolerance of shade and sunlight. For intermediate shade tolerance, we're oftentimes looking at thinning out the forest understory through a variety of techniques. And those could be mechanical thinning through cutting, herbicide use to kill stems and leave them standing, prescribed fire, or we can combine those methods. And so a couple of methods have been used here, both mechanical to drop larger diameter understory trees, and then also prescribed fire to kill some of the smaller diameter material and brush and shrubs. And so we can put those different techniques together to create that open understory that allows diffuse sunlight to come through the tree canopies and provides that environment that's very favorable for the development of any intermediate shade tolerant trees that are really adapted to that disturbance regime. And so what the hope is here is this is going to be working on reestablishing oak and hickory as the dominant species on a site where a lot of the stems we see on the ground were sugar maple. So because of the shade, it was transitioning to a shade tolerant species mix as regeneration. So that type of disturbance is necessary to move it back toward what historically has been, and that's an oak and hickory dominated site. We can also make sure we're looking at the appropriate amount of canopy gaps. And so providing some additional sunlight coming in from above may also be important on some sites. to get that regeneration of the intermediate shade tolerant species. Now we've got to be careful because if we provide too much daylight, shade intolerant trees can get established and maybe have enough sunlight to grow. And oftentimes they grow faster than the intermediate shade tolerant trees, which are oftentimes emphasizing root growth early in their life. So we're kind of hitting a balance between providing some sunlight, but not too much sunlight to favor those species that might outgrow our target species. And of course, the use of fire is oftentimes a very useful and important tool, and being applied more and more often on the land as we start seeing the benefits of prescribed fire in conjunction with this canopy thinning and understory removal. For shade tolerant species, it's arguably a little bit simpler. We really kind of use kind of a light hand in terms of management to favor these species over time, although we can still certainly do forest thinning and forest harvesting and successfully regenerate these shade tolerant species. So this is actually an example up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but the same practices would be applied here in a maple stand. And this is what we call individual tree selection. And so it's a system where individual trees of various diameters are harvested to thin the forest stand, provide additional growing space for both trees that we want to grow, but also additional regeneration of these shade tolerant trees. But what we're doing is not creating much in the way of any kind of real canopy gaps. And you'll see that there are small spaces for additional growth between those crowns, but those spaces are going to fill in pretty quickly. So we're really keeping a pretty good canopy of shade on this site as we manage. And that's going to make it very friendly for those shade tolerant species like sugar maple, beech, and basswood. And that's absolutely an appropriate management approach on some sites. Some of our north facing slopes, lower cove sites in our hill ground, high fertility soils, maybe in northern Indiana and places, it's going to be really hard for us to regenerate oaks on those because there's so many competing tree species. And it may make sense to really favor the shade tolerant species on those sites and practice this type of uneven age management where we're just taking individual trees here and there and selection harvesting to produce really small little gaps that are essentially a thinning rather than an opening. And that's where our challenge exists. And so we've got a lot of stands in Indiana that look like this or something similar, and that is an oak overstory or an oak and hickory overstory. In northern Indiana, it might be a black walnut, oak, ash, mixed species overstory, but many species that are not tolerant of shade. And then we've got an understory that's rapidly developing into a sugar maple, beech, and or basswood understory of shade tolerant species. And in some locations, it might be elm and hackberry that are dominating. And we have to recognize that if we want to maintain the species that are dominant in the overstory now, we have to change the conditions in those stands. So the fact that there's enough shade to favor the growth of sugar maple, beech, basswood, hackberry, and elm means that we're not going to be regenerating the oak and hickory that maybe we'd like to have, or the walnut and tulip tree that maybe we'd like to have. And so it requires us to consider the silvics of the species we want to favor and the silvicultural techniques that we need to use in the context of succession and how it works. And sometimes that's a hard choice for landowners because it means we've got to introduce more disturbance. And so if we're really interested in maintaining regeneration of oak and hickory, we're going to have to probably do some understory thinning, team it up with perhaps some prescribed fire well applied on the site, and then followed up potentially with some overstory thinning as well to kind of nurse along the regeneration that develops in that process. And it may take 10 to 15 years or more to get those in a position where they're going to be competitive, and we actually do a harvest that provides more sunlight and allowing those established seedlings to grow. So it's a more complicated management than we have historically done with our single tree selection that favors a shade tolerance. But it's going to be necessary to regenerate some of these species that are semi-tolerant of shade or shade intolerant. And so once again, for the shade intolerant species, we need larger scale disturbances, openings in the forest with full sunlight coming into those openings to regenerate those species. One of the other issues we're dealing with is the encroachment of invasive shrubs in particular, and some invasive trees into our woodlands. And I have real concerns that these are, in fact, successional dead ends. And so, because of the shade tolerance and high competitive nature and the ability to really completely occupy understories of many of these invasive shrubs, this is Asian bush honeysuckle, they could potentially exclude good quality native tree regeneration in the future. And so, what opportunity is there in a situation like this to regenerate desirable trees? It's really limited. So, we have to address this invasion of invasive species into our woodlands to make sure that it's not so dominant that it actually is driving our forest stands toward just invasive competition in the future as opposed to native species. That may not mean that we've got to get rid of every invasive shrub, but we certainly need to greatly reduce their numbers in association with the management we're doing. And it's best to do that before we do any kind of overstory release. And so understory work to take out the invasives, whether that be using prescribed fire, followed up with herbicides to kill the resprouts, or mechanical techniques and then herbicide applications, really highly recommended to get those under control before we start creating gaps in the canopy that allows sunlight into those stands, which these species will respond to very positively and actually start producing more seed in many cases. So don't let your woodland become a dead end because of this invasive species invasion. The other species we have to deal with to some extent is white-tailed deer. And so we do have pretty high population levels of white-tailed deer. They have a demonstrable impact on the regeneration of forest trees and shrubs, on planted trees. We've already shown an example where a landowner is going to the extent of investing in electrified fencing to get his planted seedlings past the deer. And so it's important to evaluate the pressure that white-tailed deer are applying in your woodland, and then what kind of management practices and approaches you might use to address those issues. And we actually have a deer impact toolbox here through Purdue Extension. You can use the website or the QR code to go to that. But I highly recommend that. It gives you tools to evaluate what impact deer are having on your property right now, and then some suggestions as to how to manage those impacts and evaluate what types of management might be most effective. But it doesn't pay to ignore the impact of white-tailed deer. We know they are an ecological driver on our landscape at this point in time because of their numbers and their activities. So it's something that needs to be included in our considerations for management. And one of the things I would say is that one of the wonderful things about silviculture and applying the silvics of individual trees in those silvicultural prescriptions and using succession to our advantage is that it can actually promote the diversity of wildlife on sites. And so we've got a large scale, long term experiment going on with several other institutions at Yellowwood and Morgan Monroe State Forests called the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment. And we're looking at the impacts of forest management on a wide variety of organisms, but including forest birds. And so we have folks doing inventories before we did any kind of harvesting on the sites that we're studying. And we included Brown County State Park, that's BCSP at the bottom there, as kind of a control, a large area that has not had harvesting for many decades and won't be harvested because of the policies of the state park. And so you can see the inventory information. The dark green is early successional bird species, so birds that tune in on young forest and brushy habitat. And you can see pre-harvest, we had very small numbers of those early successional birds in place. Mature forest birds, pretty common, consistently across those areas. And then all other birds, perhaps they're generalists or migrants that are not too picky about the habitat types they're in. And you can see the consistency across the sites. But once we started applying management practices, we saw some really big changes in terms of the numbers and diversity of bird species detected. And so you can see the average number of bird species detected pre-harvest was around the 15 per point that they're inventorying. Once we started doing some management, we had some sites that were over 20. And interestingly, those sites are the ones where we're producing the most sunlight exposure on the forest floor, and we're getting this establishment of young forest habitats. And as I mentioned, it's a habitat type that's really lacking on the landscape. And so our greatest diversity and our highest number of early successional guild forest birds was in the clear-cut area. We still had some mature forest gill birds there, reduced for sure. We had a higher diversity of all the other birds as well. And then the next one was the patch cut, which is essentially a small group opening. So same kind of practice, but smaller in scale than the clear cut. Now, it's important to recognize that this is all still in a mostly intact forest matrix. And so these are patches of habitat in a mature forest. And I think that adds to the benefit in that we've got that diversity of habitats all in close proximity to one another. But it's an example where we can actually use disturbance and the characteristics of succession following that and an understanding of the silvics of these tree species to really leverage our ability to increase the diversity of birds and other wildlife we may have an opportunity to see on our properties. So some examples of a bird species with different types of habitat requirements, but we found in young forest areas at the he. So the ruffed grouse typically likes forest areas that are anywhere from 8 to 10 to 30 years old as part of their habitat. They will use older forests and sometimes even younger forests, but that's it seems to be an important age block for them to do well. And we've gone from huntable populations of ruffed grouse to ruffed grouse being endangered in Indiana, no longer huntable, and really almost absent on the landscape. But once we started doing some cutting at the he, there were some photos taken by Patrick Rule, pictured here on the right. I'm sorry to be covering part of his face there, showing that grouse were starting to use that habitat again once that forest started growing back. Pat is holding a worm-eating warbler, and this was consistently thought to be purely a kind of a mature, close canopy forest area bird, but yet he had a kind of a record capture of young worm-eating warblers in these clear-cut areas. And they were utilizing these areas, we think, for feeding, escape cover, and opportunities to grow up and develop in that really heavy cover with a lot of food available with all the berries, fruits, and bugs that were available in those clear cuts. In the lower left is a yellow-breasted chat. This is a species that really likes young forest and brushy habitats. And so does very well in those young forest areas. We're not going to find it typically in mature forests. And then bottom right here is the cerulean warbler, also a bird that's being studied at the he. And we're finding that even though it was also thought to be very much like worm-eating warblers, they're utilizing these clear-cut areas on the edges for nesting and actually feeding in the interiors. So we're finding that this disturbance regime and providing a diversity of habitats in a patchwork across the landscape can actually be quite beneficial to a variety of wildlife habitat and species maybe that are suffering in other locations. So to wrap this up, some recommendations. Number one, this can be a complex area. And we can't always even predict, even as professionals, where exactly succession is going to take us. We get some unusual things happening sometimes. So it's a good idea to work with your forester and other natural resource professionals in this decision-making process about management on your property. It's also important to define your objectives. What do you hope to accomplish? What kind of future conditions or benefits do you want from your forest? That's going to help direct the activities of the professionals you work with if you've got a clear set of objectives you've developed. And then we need an evaluation of your property and the potential present, and that can be done in conjunction with you and your natural resource professionals, including your forester. So a good look over an inventory of your property to see what's there, see what the conditions are, and what possibilities exist. And as we mentioned, not every site is suited to every tree community. And so we want to work with the land we've got, not try to force it, but recognize that we're constrained by the silvics of those species and what happens in succession when we apply silvicultural techniques on the ground. Some sources that you can use to learn more. An excellent source for silvics of individual trees across North America is a USDA publication, Silvics of North America. It's 2 volumes, one conifers, one deciduous hardwoods, and the QR code is here, or you can do a search under Silvics of North America. That'll be very effective, get you to where you need to go. Excellent resource, essentially the life history of several hundred tree species that we can locate here in North America. On the left-hand side here, Forestry for the Birds Landowner Guide and Silvicultural Guide. So there's a small landowner guide that essentially gives the life characteristics of what we call the birder's dozens. And it's a variety of bird species in decline that use a variety of different forest habitats. And then the silvicultural guide actually provides management direction and advice for favoring those species. And you can access that through the QR code on the right or through searching those titles. And then another good resource, this is really aimed more at practicing professionals, but landowners can get a lot of good information here as well, are the Central Hardwood Notes. And that is the bottom right QR code. So all great references that you can utilize to learn more about the silvics and silviculture that's required for the tree species and what impact they're going to have on birds and other wildlife. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present this information in webinar form. If you do have questions, feel free to contact me at lfarlee@purdue.edu. And I also encourage you to visit our Forestry and Natural Resources Extension website. You can use the QR code here or simply Google, or pardon me, web search that title, and that will take you right there. So thank you once again. I hope you find this information useful, and we appreciate your time.